In one of my recent videos, I talked about guidelines for how to figure unfigured bass lines, especially for early basso continuo. You can check that video out if you haven't seen it already. But in this video, I want to show you how to apply those rules to actual music. So in this video, we'll take a look at Giovanni Gabrieli's Sonata number 21 for 3 violins or other instruments in basso continuo. And I'll show you how to apply the rules for figuring unfigured basses to this piece and to your own early basso continuo repertoire. Okay, let's dig in. So we're going to begin by looking only at the bass line and putting in figures just from that based on the figures or guidelines for unfigured basses. Then after that, we'll take a look at all the other parts in addition and see where we need to change any figures and where the rules for figuring unfigured basses might have led us astray. This isn't the way I generally put in figures in real life, because you usually need to see all the parts to make sure all your figures are correct. But I want to start with just the bass line in this video because in early basso continuo, sometimes the other parts can be somewhat harmonically confusing. And if you wrote out a continuo part just based on what's in the other lines of music, you would probably end up with something that doesn't make a lot of harmonical sense. So working from just the bass line can actually bring quite a bit of harmonic clarity when working with early basso continuo. Oh, and by the way, if you want to learn more about basso continuo or about the harpsichord or about early music in general, please subscribe to my channel where I put out new videos every Tuesday about all those topics. Okay, so we're going to look at about the first 27 measures or so of the Gabrieli Sonata number 21. The first rule of unfigured basses that we can apply is that sharpened notes usually get a 6/3 chord. This happens in measures 1 and measures 3 where there are Fs that have sharps on them, and even though those are in the key, though not in the key signature, they can still be considered sharpened bass notes. Now, those notes are on a weak part of the measure, and they pass by rather quickly since this piece is probably going to be about 50 to 60 beats per minute for the whole note. So you may not need to change chords, but I think it depends most of all on what instrument you're playing for basso continuo. If you're playing a sustaining instrument like the organ, then you're probably going to need to switch chords or at the very least peel your hand off for those notes so that there aren't clashing sounds. But if you're playing an instrument with a lot of decay, like the harpsichord or the theorbo, you may not need to switch chords because it may die enough by that time that it's not interfering with the harmony. So in the end, I think if you're playing the organ, you'll need to switch to a 6th chord or just play a 3rd above that, or a 10th in this case probably, so that you don't have clashing harmonies. Our next guideline for unfigured basses is that when the bass line moves up by a half step, the first chord is usually a 6/3 chord. This happens in measure 9 as well as in measures 20 and 23. But we have to take a closer look at what's actually happening in measures 20 and 23. They're a little bit different than measure 9. If you take a look at those measures, you'll see that there's actually a half cadence happening, or the approach to a half cadence. And so the normal rule that the first chord before a half step in the bass takes a 6/3 doesn't actually apply in those cases. And we'll come back to in a minute what chords are appropriate there. So now the next rule that we can apply is that when the bass leaps up a 4th or down a 5th, the first chord usually takes a major 3rd, even if you're in a minor key. So that happens all over in this piece, so let's add those in. That happens between measures 2 and 3, so the Ds in measure 2 take a major root position chord. Then that happens again between measures 4 and 5 and in measures 5 and 6, but those are already in the key signature, so we don't need to add in any figures. Next it happens in measures 7 and 8, and 10 and 11, 11 and 12, 14 to 15, 15 to 16, and then a bunch more times after that, as you can see. This is really starting to take shape now with the figures. But now we need to go back and take a look at where we might have some cadential figures and cadential motion and add those in. That'll be in a lot of the places where we were just looking at where the bass leaps up a 4th or down a 5th. So let's change the applicable places over now to cadential figures. In this piece, most of them will be the longer form cadence of 5/3, 6/4, 5/4, 5/3, because of the time period and style of the writing in this piece. But we'll keep the major thirds that we put in the last step. Now, there are a few more things we know about cadences in this time period that can help fix ours up. Most early 17th century cadences were major, even if the key was minor, and this is especially true in early Baroque Italian music. So we can go ahead and change the cadences still left over in our piece where the final note is a minor chord instead of a major, such as in measures 8 and 12, and make those chords major chords. We can also return to the half cadences we looked at earlier. We know in this time period that half cadences often were approached with a 7/6 suspension on the penultimate note, and that works perfectly for the half cadences we have in measure 21 and the one between measures 23 and 24. The one last thing we know about the figures before looking at the other parts is that notes that pass by quickly in stepwise motion, instead of by leaping around, usually don't get a new chord. So we can mark all those passing quarter notes in this piece with a held over chord, i.e. a marking showing that the chord from the previous note holds over. Now that we've done all that work from just the bass line, it's time to finally look at what's in the other parts and see what figures we might need to change and add in the few figures that are left that we haven't put in yet. Here are all the errors based on just looking at the bass line. As you can see, it's actually not that many considering that we haven't even looked at the other parts at all yet. In measure 8, at the end of the measure, we need to move to a 6/4 chord because of what's happening in the third solo line, and then that chord holds over to the downbeat of the next measure before resolving. The same thing happens in measures 12 and 13, and the second chord of measure 12 is also minor instead of major. Okay, only 2 more corrections to go. The full score shows us that in measure 14, the motion isn't actually cadential. Instead, it's kind of similar to what has been happening leading up to it in the sequencing material, where you have minor chords at the beginning and end of the measure, and the middle is a 6/4 chord that holds over. And then finally, the other parts show us that the first 2 chords in measure 22 are major chords instead of minor. That's it. That's all our corrections. We now have all our figures in for this section, which we mostly figured out just from the unfigured bass line. I'll put a list in the description below that shows all of the steps we just walked through for figuring unfigured basses. You can also check out my video, as I mentioned earlier, about figuring unfigured basses, which talks about most of these steps as well. Now that we've got all the figures in, we need to think about how to shape the bass line, what voicings we want to play the chords in, and how thick of textures we want to use in different varying areas, as well as what embellishments we might add in. But none of those things are really in the scope of this video, so I'll save them for another time. Here's what the section of the Gabrieli we just figured sounds like with all the other parts. That's all for today. Please subscribe to my channel and hit that little notification bell so that you get notified every time I put out a new video. And please give this video a like if you found it useful or helpful, and leave me a comment below with any questions you may have. Thank you so much for watching.